What's up, everybody? Welcome back. This is Teach by Day. I'm Mr. Margo, and this is Middle School U.S. History. Today we're going to be looking at how some of those plans during the Constitutional Convention went. Some were successful, some caused a lot of problems, and we're going to talk about some of those things that really drive our country today, which is mostly compromises. All right, first up is the New Jersey Plan. On June 13th, William Paterson of New Jersey proposed the New Jersey Plan, which gave equal representation and a unicameral or one-house legislature, thus giving more power to the federal government than the Virginia Plan. Delegates quickly rejected this proposal and they returned to debate the Virginia Plan. However, small states like New Jersey and Delaware and Rhode Island or Connecticut, they liked this plan and they approved of it. And because it was quickly dismissed, they thought that it was too aggressive on the part by the large states. But the large states thought that it was too similar to the Articles of Confederation and they did not want to go backwards. This caused a huge rift to the point where small states said, if you're no longer willing to hear us, and this is by the end of June, maybe early July of that year, we may not actually be a part of the Union and we will walk out. Along comes Roger Sherman, one of the 5 men that was on that Declaration Committee, writing the Declaration of Independence, and he creates what is at the time was known as the Connecticut Compromise, or today the Great Compromise. So Roger Sherman proposed essentially a blending of the two options. He proposes a bicameral or a 2-house legislature. One house is based on population and the other house is based on equality. Today, that house based on population is the House of Representatives, and the other one based on equality is the Senate. This alone might have saved the convention, because by combining the ideas of the Virginia and the New Jersey plans, most delegates could now agree on how representation in Congress could work, but also it divided up the power, again, being able to keep or maintain limited government and not go backwards towards the Articles of Confederation or a monarchy. So now, one house based on population, though, would require the need for a census, so we get an accurate representation of the number of people in our country. On the other hand, the based on equal representation allowed small states to make their voice heard and could affect an outcome on a vote that needed to have, or that would affect all citizens. Now, this also creates another problem, and this is where we get into the idea of, or the phrase that has been said before, of the idea of people or property. And the problem is representation. Well, if the representation is based on population, how do you count slaves? Many Southerners were very uneasy about slavery in the wake of the Declaration of Independence, because the majority of the economy in the South is based on slavery, meaning they don't pay for labor, and they were unwilling to give up those advantages. Some of the slave states actually passed laws to make it easier to free states, but many still did not. And the Southerners wanted slaves to count towards representation. This means that you would get more representatives in Congress. The Northerners said that slaves shouldn't count for the same reason that horses do not count. If you view a horse as property, they don't count towards representation. Therefore, we shouldn't count horses. You shouldn't be able to count slaves. Along comes, from James Madison, the 3/5 Compromise. He developed this as an idea that for every 5 slaves, 3 counted towards population for representation. I've heard on the internet before that this means that they counted people as 3/5 of a person. That's really a gross over-exaggeration of it. Most people, even people that disagreed with slavery, didn't really look at African Americans at all, even if they did agree that they were persons, which is why we saw the change in the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't about persons, it was about men, aka citizens. So for that reason, we're only looking at this as the blanket idea of numbers. For every 5 slaves, 3 count towards representation. However, this didn't satisfy everybody, but at least it was something that they could agree on. But this was something that was huge for a lot of states, in particular places in Georgia and South Carolina who had threatened to leave the Union if the convention decided to abolish slavery. But when we looked at places and towns in Georgia or South Carolina, slaves actually outnumbered whites. So the majority of those populations actually came from slave populations, which increased representation in Congress for southern states. They both believed that their economies would collapse in Georgia and South Carolina if slavery ended. So being that they were threatening to leave, and small states had already threatened to leave, this negotiation is very fragile. They also sort of felt like their way of life was being threatened, and this drove a lot of fear-driven arguments for many delegates. And this isn't where the compromises on slavery ended either. Congress would end up regulating trade, which means that it would regulate slavery also, including the slave trade. Since Congress couldn't place a tax on exports to other countries, it couldn't change the slave trade in America with this agreement until 1808, in which case 1808 the slave trade was banned in what will become the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. For now, at least in our terms, obviously we're in Philadelphia, which will be the nation's capital for a brief year and a half, and was the nation's capital under the Articles of Confederation. It then will move to New York for about 10 years before finally settling at Washington, D.C., where we are today. We'll talk about that later. Last compromise on slavery also added the Fugitive Slave Clause to please Southerners. This was meant to help owners recover escaped slaves regardless of where they're caught. If they're caught in Massachusetts, a free state, they would still be sent back to their servitude. And while this condition of servitude is horrible, and it is hard to understand or wonder what the nation might look like if abolitionists had took a hard stance on slavery then, maybe the country would be divided, maybe there wouldn't have been a civil war, maybe it would have worked out, maybe, who knows. But that's not where our decisions ended, and that's not where the debates ended, and that's not even where the compromises ended. The next debate comes over the executive decisions. Who's the person who should lead the government? That was also a pretty major debate. Many options were proposed, but the executive branch came down to 1 or 3 people. Yes, they even debated 13, one leader for every state, which we do have as a governor, but they don't all meet in D.C. and decide what to do with the country. I think 50 people running the country right now maybe would be interesting, but we'll see. Those in favor of one-person leadership didn't mind the idea, but they hated the fact that there was this prospect of a king-like person coming over again and ruling too much over the people. But they were rewarded in the ideas that a king-like person wouldn't be able to exist because of a system of checks and balances established by Congress and enforced by both the legislative, executive branches, and even the judicial branch when necessary. Others that wanted 3 executives would draw from different regions of the country, north, middle, south. Eventually, they settle on one person. And they created terms to limit that person's ability to gain power. That idea that also would create a vice president, and that would fill the office if that person died, and therefore a president and a vice president were elected at the same time, but on different ballots or different tickets. Next time, join us as we start looking at the rest of the workings of the Constitution. If you learned something, hit that like and subscribe button, or just share us out. Maybe you can find somebody who needs this. That would be great. If you got content ideas, feel free to hit them into the comments. Thanks for watching. We appreciate it.